We come to the 49th gate of revolution. And we have seen through the fellowship of man that when you get to the 13.6 and you get to the optimism, it is the optimism that there is value in everyone. Remember that it is the 49 that will establish the principles of who gets access to the resources. And the 13.6, the collective, says everyone has access. The 49.6 is tribal. It has a different rule system about who has the right to access and who doesn't have the right to access. The right angle cross of explanation, the 49.4 and the 43.23. The awareness as an emotional system, the clarity possible of recognizing what is needed or not. Food distribution. Again, we're dealing with a mystical channel and the 49th gate and its role in our mystical process. Remember that we are dealing with the solar plex, and as such, you must see very clearly that our principles have always been conditioned by the tribal emotional wave. The principle that it's established when you feel in pain and you are without hope is different than the principle you establish when you're full of hope and without pain. This goes back to our understanding of the nature of the solar plex and how the solar plex works. And it goes back to our understanding of the nature of clarity. When you first come to design at the training level for an analyst, we get into discussions about the nature of the frequencies of awareness. We know that through the splenic system that awareness is something that is spontaneous and it's weak. That is, it has no capacity to insist. It can't come back and tell you again. And that this spontaneous awareness is the only consistent and valuable awareness in a human being that can actually have inner authority. So we have people, according to their designs, who have splenic authority. And it is the spontaneous authority to stay healthy, to stay alive. In the ajna system, what is clear is that the mind, the ajna, has no inner authority, and it's a good thing because its frequencies over all time. In other words, that if you make a mental decision, that for the rest of your life you are going to have to deal with it. That's the punishment for giving the mind inner authority. So the first thing we recognize about awareness is that splenic awareness is not something you can ever possibly understand, but it's something that automatically guarantees you survivability. That the mind is always busy trying to tell you what to do, but has no authority over your life. And then you get to the solar plex system. Now, at the same time that the 54.4 keyed the transformation of our 7 to 9 centered system at the discovery of Uranus at the end of the 18th century, that the emotional system began its process of getting ready to become an awareness, something that began between the birth of Buddha and Jesus as an initial stage. Now, it's very important to make the distinction that the solar plex system as it stands today in the world is not an awareness, but that is not to diminish its capacity to guide the individual who has a defined solar plex. It's about understanding the nature of solar plex clarity. And clarity is the first stage to the opening up of awareness. Clarity is about time and reference. You know, this discussion we have had throughout our human design work of being able to deal with the solar plex by recognizing that no decision can be made until the wave has been experienced. This is clarity. Now, what that means at the mundane level, in terms of the quality of awareness displayed in a human being, is that the splenic being can be aware in the moment, but that is its limitation. That's a limitation. In other words, this is first impression awareness. But the solar plex cannot survive on first impression, because out of that will come disaster. That the solar plex builds up its framework of clarity by having different places in the wave where it looks at and examines the same thing. A solar plex being who can wait out the wave has a deeper and more profound understanding of the other than the splenic being in their spontaneous recognition. In other words, there is a real reward for the patience required to establish that clarity that is a depth of recognition. Now, it tells us about the world and it tells us about relationships. Almost all relationships involve emotional definition, which means there is no truth in the now, which means that only over time can clarity be established. So this whole business about the 49 being a gate of principles that drive the tribe, please understand how volatile and destructive these principles can be when they're guided by the ignorance of the wave and the impact on the wave of these beings. I know this in a deeply personal way in my life. You know, the pain involved of being caught up in the wave through the 49th gate. And how unclear the principles are when conditioned by the blinding power of emotions. Ideally, the transformation of forms based on the highest principles and not simply for power. If you're the one that decides when the sheep gets slaughtered and who gets to eat it, you can get into a real power trip. In the marriage contract, it's the 49th gate that says, you will obey me. And if you do not obey me, I will divorce you. Which leads to a lot of divorce. The first line. Remember, first lines are always the basis of a hexagram. The basis of revolution. The basis of establishing a principle is by the law of necessity. Remember that this stream, this channel, is all about need. In other words, that the principle should be based on need, genuine need. How many sheep do we actually need in order to feed all of those people that deserve to have access to the food? Revolution has no support unless it's perceived as necessary. The 49 has no power without the pressure of the 19. It needs that support. It needs that pressure. And without the 19, it doesn't know what the needs are. So it's difficult to establish the principles. Remember, in sexuality, this is the bride and the groom. This is a feeling out process in order to see who can get the best deal. Jupiter exalted. The understanding and application of this law to maximize expansion of support and thereby ensure viability. That is, the awareness that the potential of a principle is based on it being accepted as viable. Now remember, the first line is a line of introspection and wonder. They're really trying to figure out what is the law of necessity and what is really necessary. This is not transpersonal. The sun in detriment, and you know this will have impact on this cross of explanation. The misuse of influence. And you can see that as an incarnation, that's common. The misuse of influence to insist that necessity can be created out of action, the helter-skelter syndrome, to commit acts of disorder as proof that disorder exists. In other words, there is an understanding, a recognition that necessity creates the principles. And so if you have principles that you want to establish and there doesn't seem to be any necessity, this is an attempt to create the necessity, and could be quite disturbing, as we all know. You understand the reference to helter-skelter. This was Charlie Manson's scheme that if he could kill white people gruesomely and blame it on black people, he could get a racial war. You know, that's the helter-skelter syndrome. By the way, if you got the 49-1 in detriment, you're not Charlie Manson. Let's hope. This is a brutal gate. If you take a look through this wonderful collection that Chaitanya put together of charts, famous people. Now you just sit there and you just go through every one of those charts of all these people that are notorious or famous or whatever, and you count how many 49th gates you find. It's extraordinary. I mean, it's just one of those things that pops up immediately. Just count them. You see them in just about every one of these people. This ability to have impact at the most basic level of the tribe. And remember, when the tribe changes, everything changes. Don't change the tribe, nothing changes. No matter what the collective standards are, unless the tribe accepts them, there is no real change. So there's great power here in this revolutionary force to attract the support of the adrenaline pressure of the 19. To then drive the 37 a smile like hell, to get good 40s, to take on the willpower, and so forth and so on until you get through the whole tribal process. Second line, the last resort. I guess that must be Pune. I don't know. That's a joke. I am mean. I'm a 49. The 49-2 doesn't want to give anybody their principles. They live by their principles naturally, though they don't know what the hell they are. And again, remember, if you're unaware of your nature and you're a 49, your principles are changing. They're changing according to the chemistry of your emotional wave. How easy to move from being a Democrat to a Republican in the movement of that wave. And if you recognize that we are an emotional nation in an emotional world made up of emotional tribes and emotional individuals, that you can see that these principles, that when the emotional wave of the nation goes into a down phase, and the nation becomes depressed, and that their hope seems to be lost, and they're in pain, the principles that they will abide by, that they will accept, can be devastating. This is a gate. There are two gates in the body graph that are gates of blood. The 25th gate, the gate of innocence, which is the sacramental blood, that is the transformed blood into a spiritual balm. And here the 49th gate, bloodletting. This is where sacrifice takes place. This is a bloody place. I know so many 49 butchers because that's the 49 place. The earth exalted. The determination to exhaust every possible peaceful avenue for change, and then when satisfied that no other course is possible, to plan in detail before revolution is attempted. The potential to explore every possibility before rejecting or accepting. Now think about that. That second line is an inner revolutionary. They got their own principles at work. Every once in a while, somebody is knocking on their door, trying to get them to be the one that takes responsibility for what resources and who has a right to them. They're not necessarily comfortable with that process. Remember that the lower trigram always has difficulty because it doesn't know there's a gate at the other end. A 49 that does not know that there's a 19 whose needs must be fulfilled or the support is lost has great difficulty in establishing a principle beforehand that they know that the other will support. And revolution is not possible without that support. Pluto in detriment, the overwhelming revolutionary urge that is impatient with accommodation and negotiation. The tendency here is to the coup d'etat that has little general support. Impatience with accommodation. Impatience with having to deal with these people that are distracting you. You have your principles. You don't know if they really fulfill the needs of the other side. And you have all these people trying to tell you that your principle may not work and perhaps you should learn about new principles. 49 twos have to be educated politically because the 49th gate is very, very political. The third line, popular discontent, with of course Neptune exalted. It's one of those things to see in this line, by the way. This popular discontent is conditioned by the two most outward planets, which means that they have very special generational values and come in at only certain times in our process of life coming into the world. Neptune exalted, the ability to destroy antiquated forms once the restrictions have been removed. The potential and sensitivity to reject failed principles or relationships. Now this is bonds made and broken. If you won't support my principle, then I will not have anything to do with your need, and I will go on and find somebody who needs my principle. Now, of course, at the same time, you can feel like, if you're the 49-3, that nobody will support your principle, and of course that can make you very uncomfortable. It is this whole business of banging into things. Pluto in detriment, with general support, a savageness in eliminating the old order that may permanently scar the new, an insensitivity in rejection and rejecting. Now, of course, what happens is that the 49 says, I have this principle. You follow this principle or you don't get to eat. Period. You don't get to come to the table. Period. And I have the support of others in that. So, of course, you can run into situations that are savage. Where there are those who are left out, who in terms of the collective have every right to be included. Remember this real difference between the 13-6 and the 49-1. They're really different, and they have to find a way ultimately to come together, and they only do that through mutation, which has to be an individual process. The 13-6 says, the collective says, all beings are equal. It's this Everybody has within them this spark. Everybody has a right to all the basics. And the 41 1 says that all is very nice, but it has to be according to the law of necessity. I have to look after my family before I'm going to feed any stranger. And I'm not going to sacrifice the security of my family and its resources in order to give most of that away in taxation or social welfare programs to benefit those people who don't do anything, who aren't part of our tribe, who don't contribute to our community, and so forth and so on. This is a major, major point in our evolution, to come to grips with these two different processes. And of course, one of them is totally emotional. The tribal principles are totally emotional. Easy to be optimistic in times of hope, not in times of pain. When you get to the upper trigram here, you get to the transpersonal capacity. And this transpersonal capacity is so important here in this gate. In other words, that principles are legitimized through contact with the need. Now, it doesn't mean that the needs are correct. It simply means that there is a completeness when the principles meet and recognize that there are specific needs out there that condition the principles. And the fourth line is very important because, after all, its job is to externalize what has been gained in the lower trigram as a process. It's there to externalize a foundation. And it's there to externalize the principles, and they are fixed in externalizing their principles. And so you get this term that's common in American politics. You get the term of platform. In other words, they establish and concretize their principles and say, this is what we're going to externalize. And we're externalizing what we think you over there really need. And they show you what it is. They externalize it for you. Here are principles. I think you need these principles. Very political. Jupiter exalted a political and social agenda embodied in guarantees to human rights that ensures a just and valued replacement of the old order. Christ, it sounds good. Well, it does, doesn't it? Beware of do-gooders. A potential sensitivity to the needs of society. Note the potential. This is what the principles are supposed to do. They're supposed to be there to benefit the society as a whole. And of course, that's the claptrap that always comes with it. That's what they're going to do for you. Read the fine print in the platform, after all. In other words, you're dealing here not with a collective politician, you're dealing with an emotional politician. You're dealing with an emotional force that's going to bring you up and fill you with hope, and also take advantage of being able to bring you down and fill you with despair so that you will accept its principles. They're tricky. I mean, don't forget that. Mars and detriment. Promises, promises, promises. And only to guarantee support with little possibility of implementation. A potential to insensitivity, take advantage of the needs of society. It's very easy to blame these people for externalizing principles for their own gain. And recognizing as they're externalizing these principles, that they don't necessarily have principles that are really of value for you. We have that all the time. You got all kinds of people that put out their political agenda, their political platform, in order to get tax advantages and contributions and slush funds and this and that, and they don't really care what they're putting out or if it really is something you need. It's emotional, after all. It can be very unclear. I mean, my principles in the course of my lifetime have changed so much. There I was with my unconscious 49th gate in an undefined solar plex system. Every time somebody was emotionalizing me, I had another kind of principle, depending on where they put me in the wave. In the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of this fourth line, we do have the change to the juxtaposition cross, where the 4323 is replaced by the 14 and the 8. So we have the 49 and the 4, the 14 and the 8, and this is the juxtaposition cross of principles. These are people that are fixed in their fate to externalize social principles and to try to make sure that society benefits. Now, one of the things that you get out of my tone is that there is a very powerful destructive, distracting potential that comes out of the principles when they are strictly emotional and are without clarity. However, at the moment that there's clarity in those principles, there can be deep and lasting value in them for the community. And of course, that's what it's all about. Finding a way to be able to be clear in one's principles. This is both understanding the emotional system and how it operates in you, but also recognizing that those principles themselves cannot be established correctly unless you are entering into your relationships as yourself. And that the need or the support that you gather is correct because you've entered into that relationship correctly. And that brings us to the left angle cross of revolution. I always have that Beatles song in my head, you say you want to rev. Organization, the fifth line. And of course, by now you can quote this line by heart, I hope. I've repeated it enough to you. The moon exalted. Practical provisions for the needs of others in revolutionary times which ensure support and continued understanding. It's my mantra in life. I'm a 49-5. And it's one of those things I know. Practical provisions in revolutionary times, otherwise you are simply not useful. You're just not useful. Everything in its time. Fifth lines have to live by that. Everything in its time. To build the projection field. A potential sensitivity to the practical needs of others. And again, it has to be rooted in clarity. But the 49-5 is not going to make any attempt to establish those principles other than in times of crisis. Because it learns that in the nature that the second line, its harmony, learns to see how difficult it is to bring principles and get their support. Mars and detriment, a concentration on the organization of power to clearly defined authority, often at the expense of higher principles, a rejection of higher principles and seeking to organize others. This is very common in revolution, that you have a set of principles that you have used to attract all the peasants to, and then you tell them, look, we have to go through this phase first before we get to that. First we have to have the killing, the purging. First we have to tell you exactly what to do for the rest of your life. And maybe by the time that your great-grandchildren are born, the damn system will fall apart and they'll have a chance. But don't expect us to give you those principles that we promised you, because in the interim we can't get there until we do our dirty work. They're good at organizing. They do have the projection field. And in a time of crisis, they can bring a principle that says to them, look, the end will justify the means. You know, the revolution of the proletariat. Bloody detriment. And when I say that, please understand, that has to do with being unaware and ignorant. None of these things operate in such a chaotic way when you're living at your own nature. You are no longer chaos. The sixth line, attraction. Remember, this is the cross of revolution. You know, you've got a child that's a 49.5 or a 49.6. You know, you have to teach them that the principles that they see are things that have to come over time, and that they can't just let their emotions dictate it. How accepting you can be of regulation when you're in a good mood, and how offensive it seems to be when you're in a bad mood. When you get to the sixth line, when you get to the end of this process, you get to a point of recognizing that in order for revolution to succeed, the end result is that the community as a whole has to have more than what it started off with. It's very important to grasp. A sixth line isn't interested in simply making contact with the support in the 19. That sixth line has a perspective that goes to the whole tribal circuit, and the tribal circuit has only one expression through the 45, through the gate of possessiveness of I have and I don't have. And that the role of the 45 is to provide security for the tribe and to educate them. Or to educate them so that they will have greater security. That the greater the tribe, the more educated and the wealthier it is. So the 49.6, in looking at principles of revolution, recognizes that it will be the final material evidence that validates or not the revolution. You know, you can have a Nicaraguan Sandinista government that promises that it's going to do land reform. Give all the peasants land. Wonderful concept. Didn't happen. And the revolution failed. So it's very important to understand that at the end of any revolution, that revolution is about the material benefits that can be derived, nothing more, nothing less. And revolution is driven by resources. If you have a segment of society that feels that they are being held back, that they do not have fair access to the resources of the community, you're breeding revolution. Because that's what it is. And that the revolutionary has its greatest impact and has its greatest support the moment that it can promise a material reward as a result. We kill all the rich people, we give you all their bank accounts and credit cards. Attraction. The power of revolution in action to expand its support. And this is the whole thing that the 49.6 knows. It's the harmony, it's the resonance, after all, to the 19.6 of the recluse, the fool on the hill. It says, I've seen so many revolutionary principles go into the toilet. I've seen so many people who have broken their hearts By the way, revolution goes through the heart. Revolution breaks your heart. I've seen so many people with broken hearts because the revolution was unfulfilled. And then I'm not going to get involved in being a revolutionary until I see that revolution can really work. They can really benefit those. Neptune exalted an innate impressionability that transforms the fence-sitter into the committed. The sensitivity and potential to embrace and transform others. But only when you really see that it's possible. There are very, very few 49 sixes that are revolutionary. We live in an unaware, uneducated, solar-plex-dominated environment with transitory principles that are constantly leaving people hungry, killing people, abandoning people, disappointing people, and breaking their hearts all over the planet all the time. Very difficult to see a revolution worth supporting. I consider the work of teaching human design as revolutionary work. In other words, that this is a principle, a practical principle, that's out there to gather support. And if it weren't for the 19s and the 37s in my process, there would be no human design in the world. Because they gave it the support at the tribal level. When mutation is accepted at the tribal level, it means that everything can be mutated. Everything. Saturn in detriment, stubborn and often fatal rejectionism, oversensitivity that leads to rejection of principles and others as a rule. What I've just been discussing with you. Oh yeah, I saw that movie. Oh yeah. Come on, make a hero out of Fidel, and then explain to me the 42 or 43,000 people that were executed in the first 3 days of the revolution in public stadiums. You know. The 49-6 just sits above all of that and says, yeah. When a 49-6 accepts your principle is given great power. Out of this position, this capacity to be able to attract when one is clear that revolution can succeed, and only when it's perceived that it can succeed. That the very next step is the 30th gate, the gate of the clinging fire, the gate of the burning. It is the place where the Aquarian age will begin. It is what the mystics call the time of burning and fire that is coming. And it is this clinging fire that they're speaking of.